In the United States, civil rights are generally defined as those granted by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Ratified in the 1860s, these two amendments effectively served to outlaw involuntary servitude, guarantee the rights of life, liberty, and property, and cement equal protection of all people under the law. More recently, the term civil rights has been applied specifically to those of African Americans. Even after the ratification of the 14th Amendment ended slavery, African Americans faced a century-long battle against unjust treatment, eventually culminating in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. This movement was the broadest campaign aimed at individual human rights in American history, and served as an example for countless movements aimed at civil equality in the future.
Jim Crow laws were state and local legislation that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States, enacted after the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. Jim Crow laws varied from state to state, but almost invariably included the physical separation of black and white citizens in public settings. Alabama. Every employer of white or Negro males shall provide for such white or Negro males reasonably accessible and separate toilet facilities. North Carolina. All passenger stations in the state operated by any motor transportation company shall have separate waiting rooms and spaces and separate ticket windows for the white and colored races. Texas. The County Board of Education shall provide schools of two kinds, those for white children and those for colored children.
On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama after refusing to give up her seat for a white bus passenger. The ensuing Montgomery bus boycott, lasting 381 days, was considered a bottom-up catalyst for the civil rights movement. The Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA, was established to ensure the supervision and continuation of the Montgomery bus boycott. Young Alabama minister Martin Luther King Jr.'s role as the first president of the MIA catapulted him into the spotlight of civil rights. The boycott also served as an example for the nonviolent protests of the civil rights movement going forward.
We said if we could just get about 50 or 60% of the Negroes of Montgomery not to ride buses, this would be an effective boycott. I think that whole day we found 8 Negroes on the bus. And from that day on, that boycott was more than 99 9/10% effective.
On the 28th of August, 1963, more than 200,000 demonstrators took part in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in the nation's capital. The march was successful in pressuring the administration of John F. Kennedy to initiate a strong federal civil rights bill in Congress.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the nation's premier civil rights legislation. This act, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on July 2, 1964, outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, required equal access to public places and employment, and enforced desegregation of schools and the right to vote. It did not end discrimination, but it did open the door to further progress.
From April 29th to May 4th, 1992, a series of riots rocked the Los Angeles area in California. These riots were sparked by the decision made to acquit 4 Los Angeles police officers who were caught on amateur video recording beating an unarmed African-American motorist. In total, there were 63 deaths, 2,383 injuries, and 12,111 arrests made. These riots are one of the many examples of civil rights protests that were misaligned with the nonviolent vision of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement as a whole. However, as MLK Jr. once said, a riot is a language of the unheard, and the initial riot started as a result of built-up anger about the treatment of the Black community that finally hit a tipping point. The riots were a reaction to the lack of change going on in America and will remain as a reminder of such injustice.
Following the success of the civil rights movement, civil rights campaigns began to occur with much greater frequency. With the rapidly expanding influence of social media, many advancements in civil rights continue to grow through internet campaigns. World AIDS Day was established on December 1, 1988 to bring greater awareness to HIV and commemorate those affected by the disease. Since 1988, World AIDS Day has expanded into a year-round campaign to prevent, treat, and educate people about HIV. The Black Lives Matter movement began on July 13, 2013 as a reaction to the death of Trayvon Martin, an unarmed 17-year-old African-American boy who was fatally shot by a white man in a Florida neighborhood. After 2 days of deliberation in court, the man responsible for Martin's death was determined to be innocent. The movement was started on social media with the slogan, Black Lives Matter. In the years following, numerous protests, both peaceful and violent, were held across America in hundreds of cities. The movement rose up again in 2014 with the shooting of another unarmed black teenager by police, this time in Ferguson, Missouri.
The decades-long battle for marriage equality began in the 1970s, when it was effectively ruled that the legality of gay marriage was in the hands of the states. On June 26, 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court held in a 5-4 decision that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples in a landmark civil rights case. The Supreme Court cited both the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Obergefell v. Hodge, the landmark case that finally legalized gay marriage, came as the result of decades of couples suing their individual states in hopes of obtaining marriage licenses.
Since the 1960s, the civil rights movement has extended far beyond even Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision, protecting and empowering people of all races, genders, and sexualities. If it weren't for grassroots leaders like Rosa Parks and influential allies like the Kennedy administration, the movement would not have been possible. Although the incremental change that has been accomplished is impressive, it's important to remember that the fight for equality is far from over.
It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.